is, for me, and this kind of ties into some of the questions that I think I've seen you getting, and one of the questions that Benjamin was posing to Esther about why Jesus, and Job was, how do you make the jump to Jesus?
Yeah.
And I feel like it's kind of a, how do you make the jump from the frame that you gave us of, I don't know if it was yours, but you're who I first heard it from, God number one, God number two.
Yeah.
How do we make that jump?
Yeah.
Again, it's back to my philosophy of, man, I really want it to be true.
Yeah.
If Jesus is the only hope for me, that death is an unacceptable end to the story.
Yes.
It's offensive.
Yes.
Particularly for people who, I wrote you once on Facebook, that made it into your Jesus the Divine Lobster video, and I feel like my dad is one of those people, particularly self-made. It's even worse.
Yeah.
It seems like, and I don't know. The jump to Jesus is not a rational one. It's in some sense, but in another sense, if death is the end of the story, that is the most irrational answer that I could ever receive, that I could ever hear.
Yes.
And the jump to Jesus, I don't know. I'm not trying to give people answers. I'm sure smarter people than me could just jump in and say, it's ridiculous. It's like the last video of yours that I watched was with Job when he was reading the I don't know if it was the appendix, but it was the last thing that Lewis was saying in Miracles, where he was talking about, you have these feelings, and then it always ends the same way. Just put this stuff back. It's all material. It's all rational. If that's all that it is, I think you mentioned it would just change the way I would live very differently. I wouldn't want to live at all anymore. It's just like, what's the point of life? And I remember you talked to an atheist very early on who has his own channel, and he said, I don't know, it makes life brighter. It makes it more valuable. And that's an argument. I can see things from that perspective to a certain extent. But when you're touched by death, it doesn't make sense.
No.
That people are just gone.
Yeah.
And some people might say, well, hey, there's a doctrine in the very conservative one that, people are just gone. They just end up in hell and you never see them again. And I'm just like, that doesn't sound like Jesus either. My answer is, I don't know. Yeah. But a big part of the Jesus story is, as one of my favorite pastors out in your home state, your now home state, Mark Foreman up in, I don't know if you've ever heard of him before. He's the dad of the two of the founding members of the band Switchfoot. He pastors a church up in Encinitas, or down in Encinitas from you. He says he got up, about Jesus. The big part of the Jesus story is he got up. Don't believe that story if you don't want to, but that story is saying to us, we get to get up too. The bodies that have been stacking up in the ground for however many hundreds of thousands, however long, this is where my lack of education comes into play. Hundreds of thousands or millions or however long the human race has been around, everybody has just stacked up in the grave. And the Jesus story is, that's not the end.
That's right.
The door has been kicked open,
That's right.
So I guess my question is more of me wanting to encourage you. And I know you're mad about your sister, but it's
Oh,
at the end.
it's not just mad about my sister. And that video I made early on, the Divine Lobster, that's for me that's a video I cherish. There's a lot of my father in that video
Mhm.
because I thought a lot about my father when I made that video. And one of the things that so I saw growing up with my father and his love for people in Paterson, New Jersey, was that he ministered and he helped and he served people who this world will never know. And that even in North America, I mean, he did a lot of funerals for people who went into the potter's field because they were alcoholics, they were drug addicts, they were heroin addicts. These people had burned through their relationships with their family to the degree that when they die, you couldn't even track down family to notify. And then the county would connect with a funeral home, and then they would call my father because they knew he was willing to do funerals for nobodies. And so he would go and he would preside over burying someone in a potter's field. And you would do funerals for people who had, there were a lot of heroin going through Paterson, who, they with heroin, they completely wrecked their families because a heroin addict, they'll steal their mother's bread just to get that fix. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. And you start traveling throughout the history of the world and think of the people buried in the Great Wall of China, and think of the people, the children that were left out to die of exposure on dumps outside of Roman cities. And you just go on and on throughout human history. And you're exactly right. The bodies stack up. And so so Jesus, the text I preached on when I preached at my sister's funeral, when, Jesus deliberately, he gets the word that Lazarus is going to die and he tarries. And the sisters know that. So they're angry with Jesus when he gets there. And if you had come sooner, my brother would not have died. And so Jesus knew what he was about to put his friends through. And then when he gets to the grave, he weeps. And it's not, sniffling in a tissue. He's angry. Of course, I talked about this in the eulogy for my sister. Why is he angry? And it's exactly what you feel with respect to your father, because not only is it that he's dead, and maybe there are things that need to be said that haven't been said. Maybe that's part of it too, but it's also part of all of the, like you said, you lost him years before to alcohol, and people have lost their loved ones years before to gambling or to Alzheimer's or to on and on and on and on. And it's all that loss. And when Jesus confronts the grave, he looks at it all, and God says, no, I will not, that is not how my story is going to end. And you're exactly right. I mean, part of the reason why I'm not, why am I not an atheist? And I couldn't stand it if I were, because I can't stand to watch the suffering of this world and everything that people have lost and suffer and think that is the end. No. And so, I don't care. The funny thing about atheism is, you have all this pride about rationality, and I look at it and say, the really funny thing about atheism is that you can't tell me I ought to be an atheist, because oughts don't go down that far. They only go down as far as pride or social, social status. And I believe, it's actually a strange quote from Dostoevsky. I believe like a child that God is going to change this world into something where the kinds of sufferings that you saw in your father's life will be turned to glory. And I don't know how, but I do have inklings that, in fact, we can sense, and Peterson is right in this. I just finished a video where kind of to the end of the video, I realized that for Peterson, meaning is his sacrament. And and so what is a sacrament? A sacrament is what connects us with the other world, with the real world, with heaven. And meaning is his sacrament. Well, what does that mean? It means that for Peterson, he tastes heaven when he tastes meaning, and he is sharing that taste with people all over the world, and they're tasting it too. Mm. And so, death, I see that God can use suffering with meaning and make glory. Suffering plus meaning makes glory. And what that means is that there is hope for those who lie in the grave. And I am not going to live in the world without that hope. And, I can have, part of the reason I read miracles so often is because, I've got those doubts. And there, in my consciousness Congress, there's the secular materialist faction that keep, you think it's hard listening to Sam Harris, listen to the faction in your own head, deal with those squirrels, and so that's why you have to work these arguments, and you have to ask, do I really believe? But when it comes to this point, I will not give in, because I have seen too much loss and too much pain and too much suffering in this world, and I will not tolerate not believing that God doesn't have an answer. Because if he doesn't, then I will become something else. Because, then what should I do? And it's not pretty. So, no, you're right. So once I'm at that point, the question is, well, how should I live? Well, I should live in this story as deep as I can be. Well, what does that look like? That means being Jesus as deep as I can. And many days that's not very deep. But because why? Because Peterson is right in terms of meaning being a sacrament. He's right in that. And that's part of the reason he's lighting up the world. And when my sister died, I talked to my mother yesterday and my older sister yesterday, and so she died in November, and then of course everybody comes in, it's a big shock, you're numb, and then you're in the holidays, and then after the holidays, January, February, everybody goes home, everybody goes back to normal, and the grievers are left with their grief. And they talked about the kids. My sister was a middle school English teacher, and she was a gifted teacher, and she poured herself out for those kids, and many kids, it was in Miss Johnson's class that they had someone who saw them and knew them, and she brought them to life. That's why there were 600-700 people at the calling hours. Those people stood in line in a New England winter just to be able to shake our hand and tell us what my sister meant to them. And to think that just goes, no. And part of the reason I can't be an atheist is, what do you say at the funeral? Oh, at least they're sleeping now? No, our works follow us. And I believe what the Apostle Paul says, that we do not labor in vain. And I believe that Jesus did not labor in vain. So, no, I on one hand, yes, I grieve my sister. On the other hand, I know that my Redeemer lives, and I know I will see my sister. Now, when it comes to doing a funeral for someone for whom you don't know what the testimony of their life indicates in terms of their participation in the age to come, all I can say is that my God is good, and he will do what's right. And I don't think the problem I ultimately have with kind of a cheap universalism is that it degrades history. And I don't think that whatever God does will degrade history. And so, Lewis's The Great Divorce is a masterful work. It deals with, all kinds of these difficult questions, and we can't answer them. But the good news is we don't have to, and we can trust the one who can.